Private Olivia Brooks had been on base for 2 weeks when she watched 3 senior officers meet in a room that was supposed to be empty. Days later, classified documents went missing, and she was the only one who could say what she'd really seen and heard that night. The administrative building was quiet at 2 in the morning, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel deliberate. Private Olivia Brooks sat at the front desk of Building 4, a logbook open in front of her, a cold cup of coffee going untouched by her elbow. Overnight staff duty was considered the least desirable assignment a new soldier could draw, and most people treated it that way. Something to get through, not something to take seriously. Olivia hadn't figured out yet how to feel that way about anything on this base. She was 20 years old, 2 weeks into her first duty station, and still learning the difference between the sounds a building made on its own and the sounds that meant someone was actually there. The air conditioning cycled on with a low groan every 20 minutes. The fluorescent lights above the hallway buzzed faintly. Down the corridor, a printer occasionally clicked as it went in and out of sleep mode. Olivia had memorized all of it by her 3rd night on this rotation, the way she'd memorized the layout of her barracks room and the names of everyone in her platoon and the exact number of steps between the mess hall and the motor pool. She didn't want to be caught not knowing something. She didn't want to be the recruit who had to ask. At 01:57, she heard the side door. It wasn't unusual exactly. Officers came and went from Building 4 at odd hours, pulling files, dropping off paperwork before a morning briefing. But something about the timing made her look up from the logbook. 3 sets of footsteps, unhurried, moving with the kind of quiet that suggested people who didn't want to be heard, rather than people who simply hadn't thought about it. She recognized Colonel Whitfield first, mostly by his walk, a controlled, deliberate stride she'd seen from a distance during formation. Behind him was Lieutenant Colonel Reyes, whose name she knew because he'd addressed her platoon during in-processing, welcoming them with an easy, practiced warmth that had made her feel, for a moment, like the Army might not be as impossible as she'd feared. The 3rd officer she didn't recognize at all, older, heavy-set, a major's insignia catching the hallway light as he passed. They didn't go to any of the offices. They went into the small briefing room at the end of the hall, the one Olivia had been told that morning was reserved and empty for the week. She kept her eyes on the logbook. That was the job. Sign people in, note the time, don't make it strange. But the door to the briefing room didn't fully close, and voices carried in a way that low voices sometimes do in empty buildings, closer and sharper than they meant to be. Can't leave this room. That's the entire point of doing it this way? Already signed off on the transfer. There's no version of this where, if anyone asks, we were never... The rest dissolved into something Olivia couldn't make out, a murmur underneath the hum of the air conditioning. She told herself quickly and firmly that it was none of her business. Officers talked about things she wasn't cleared for and wasn't supposed to understand. That was true on any base, in any unit, at any hour. She had exactly 2 weeks of experience to draw on, and in 2 weeks she had already learned that a private who asked too many questions did not get treated like a promising soldier. She got treated like a problem. She wrote 0157, Building 4, side entrance in the logbook, the way she'd write down any other entry, and went back to pretending she hadn't heard anything at all. It was nearly 20 minutes before the door opened again. This time she looked up on instinct, and for half a second her eyes met Lieutenant Colonel Reyes's across the length of the hallway. He didn't look angry. He didn't look suspicious. He gave her the same easy, practiced smile he'd given her platoon on their first day, the kind of smile that was meant to put a private at ease. "Long night, Brooks," he said. He'd remembered her name. That, more than anything else, was what stayed with her. "Yes, sir," she said, because that was the correct answer, the only answer she had. He nodded once, like the exchange had settled something, and the 3 officers left through the side door without another word between them. Olivia listened to their footsteps fade across the parking lot, then sat very still for a long moment, the logbook open in front of her, the pen still in her hand. She told herself it was nothing. Officers had meetings. Sometimes meetings happened late, And sometimes people didn't want them written down anywhere formal, and none of that was strange enough to mean anything on its own. She had 2 weeks of experience. She didn't know what was strange yet and what wasn't. But she found herself looking at the clock more than usual for the rest of her shift, and when she finally closed the logbook at 0600 and walked back to her barracks in the gray early light, she couldn't shake the small, persistent feeling that she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and that somewhere underneath her exhaustion, a part of her already knew it wasn't nothing at all. Olivia Brooks had joined the Army for reasons she rarely explained in full, even to the few people on base she was starting to trust. The short version, the one she gave when someone asked, was that she wanted something that was entirely hers, not handed to her, not expected of her, not something she'd fall into because it was the easiest path available in her hometown. The longer version had more to do with her father. He'd served 8 years in the Army back in his 20s, and he talked about it the way some men talked about a marriage that hadn't worked out, with a complicated mixture of pride and disappointment that never fully resolved. He hadn't discouraged her from enlisting, not outright, but he hadn't hidden his doubt either. "You've got to have thick skin for this," he'd told her the night before she left for basic training. Not unkindly, but not gently. It's not going to care whether you're tired or scared or right. She'd carried that sentence with her through 9 weeks of basic and into her first duty station, half determined to prove him wrong and half terrified he wasn't. 2 weeks in, she still felt like she was translating a language she'd only half learned. She'd figured out which NCOs expected a fast answer and which ones wanted you to think first. She'd learned that the mess hall coffee was undrinkable after 0900, and that the fastest way to the motor pool cut through a gap in the fence nobody official had approved. She'd made one real friend, Specialist Denise Alvarez, a logistics soldier a year ahead of her who had a talent for explaining unwritten rules before Olivia embarrassed herself by breaking them. "You don't correct a sergeant in front of other privates," Denise had told her during her first week, not unkindly, after Olivia had pointed out a scheduling error in front of half the platoon. "Doesn't matter if you're right, especially if you're right." Olivia had taken that lesson and applied it broadly. Stay quiet, do the job. Don't be the private anyone has to think about twice. It had served her well enough so far, and after the night in Building 4, she found herself leaning on it harder than ever. She didn't mention what she'd overheard to Denise or to anyone. She told herself there was nothing to mention. 3 officers, a closed-door meeting, a few sentences that could have meant 100 different harmless things. Transfers happened. Paperwork got signed. She was a 20-year-old private with 2 weeks of experience, and she had no business assigning meaning to conversations she wasn't cleared to understand. For 4 days, it worked. She went back to Building 4 for her next overnight rotation, and the room at the end of the hall was locked and dark, exactly like it should have been. She almost let herself forget about it entirely. Then, on a Thursday morning, she noticed something different about the atmosphere at formation. A tightness in the way the NCOs spoke to each other. A version of quiet that felt less like calm and more like people choosing their words. By mid-morning, the reason had made its way through the unit the way things always did, second-hand and half-accurate, but unmistakable in its core. Classified logistics documents had gone missing from the division's secure files. Not lost, missing. The kind of missing that got investigators involved instead of just an annoyed supply officer. Olivia heard it first from Denise, over lunch, delivered with the particular energy of someone passing along genuinely interesting news. "They're saying it's bad," Denise said, stirring a spoon through a tray of something that had been advertised as beef stew. Like actual CID coming to base bad. Somebody signed off on something they shouldn't have, or somebody's covering for somebody. Nobody really knows. Olivia kept her eyes on her own tray. When did this happen? Like, when did they go missing? "I don't know exactly. Sometime last week, I think. Why?" "No reason," Olivia said, too quickly, and immediately regretted how it sounded. Denise glanced at her but didn't push, and the conversation moved on to something else. A rumor about a barracks inspection, a complaint about the new PT schedule. And Olivia let it move on, grateful and a little sick to her stomach at the same time. Sometime last week. She did the math without wanting to. Her overnight shift in Building 4 had been 6 days ago. Close enough that the coincidence sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. She spent the next 3 days doing what she'd always done best, which was making herself small and useful and unremarkable, hoping that whatever was unfolding around the missing documents had nothing to do with 3 officers standing in a room that was supposed to be empty. She almost believed it. She was good at believing things that let her keep her head down. Then, on Monday morning, she saw the notice posted outside the battalion headquarters, printed on plain paper without any of the formatting that made military notices feel official, which somehow made it feel more serious rather than less. Anyone with information regarding activity in Building 4 during the period of date range is requested to contact CID at the number below. All personnel are reminded of their duty to report relevant information. The date range on the notice included the night of her shift. Olivia stood in front of the bulletin board longer than she should have, other soldiers moving past her toward morning formation, the sun already hot on the back of her neck. She read the notice twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that didn't apply to her. They didn't. She thought about Lieutenant Colonel Reyes's easy smile in the hallway, the way he'd said her name like it mattered that he remembered it, and for the first time she let herself consider, really consider, without immediately talking herself out of it, that what she'd witnessed might not be nothing at all, and that somebody, somewhere, already knew she'd been the one standing at that desk. The summons came 2 days later, delivered by her platoon sergeant in the flat, unbothered tone. NCOs used for things that weren't actually routine, but were being treated that way on purpose. Brooks, CID wants 10 minutes. Building 2, 1400. Don't make it weird. She spent the hours beforehand trying to figure out what "don't make it weird" was supposed to mean, and whether she was already failing at it by turning the phrase over in her head so many times. At 13:55, she stood outside a nondescript office in Building 2, smoothing down a uniform that didn't need smoothing, and reminded herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been at a desk. She'd been doing her job. That was all. The investigator was a warrant officer named Castillo, mid-40s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had conducted this exact conversation many times before, and wasn't going to be rushed through it by anyone's nerves, including his own. He gestured her to a chair, set a small recorder on the desk between them, and asked her to state her name and confirm she'd been on duty in Building 4 on the night in question. "Yes, sir," she said. "Walk me through the shift. Anything unusual?" This was the moment she'd been rehearsing without meaning to, lying awake the night before, running through versions of an answer that all felt either too much or not enough. She told him about the side door, the 3 officers, the time she'd logged. She left out the fragments of conversation she'd overheard. She told herself this wasn't lying. She genuinely wasn't certain what she'd heard, not word for word, not with the kind of confidence that belonged in an official statement. But she knew, even as she said it, that the omission was its own kind of choice. Castillo didn't push right away. He let the silence sit for a moment, the way people did when they wanted you to fill it yourself. She didn't. He finally asked, "You didn't hear anything through the door? Even a few words?" "It was hard to make anything out clearly, sir. The AC was running." He wrote something down. She couldn't tell if he believed her or was simply noting that she hadn't been helpful. "If you remember anything else," he said, sliding a card across the desk, "anything at all, even something that seems small, call this number, doesn't matter what time." She took the card and left feeling worse than when she'd walked in, though she couldn't have said exactly why, since technically she hadn't said anything untrue. She found out why 2 days later. It was late afternoon, the kind of slow hour between duty and dinner formation when the base felt half asleep, and Olivia was cutting across the lot behind Building 4 when Lieutenant Colonel Reyes fell into step beside her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a battalion officer to be walking alongside a private with 2 weeks of experience. "Brooks," he said, in the same warm, easy tone he used with everyone. The tone that had made her platoon like him from their first day. Heard CID pulled you in. That's rough, getting dragged into something like this so early. Yes, sir. She kept walking, kept her eyes forward, unsure what else to do. For what it's worth, he said, I wouldn't worry too much. These investigations, they cast a wide net. Talk to a dozen people, and most of what they hear doesn't mean anything. It's a process. Doesn't reflect on you either way. Understood, sir. He was quiet for a few steps, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly. Still friendly, but with something underneath it that made her pay closer attention. Can I give you some advice? Soldier to soldier, not officer to private. She didn't know how to say no to that question, so she said nothing, and he took it as permission. You're 2 weeks in. That's a hard place to be. You don't have a reputation yet, good or bad. People are still forming their opinion of you, and I'll tell you honestly, the fastest way to get a reputation you don't want is to get tangled up in something like this. Especially the kind of thing where a private's account of a conversation gets misheard or misremembered, and suddenly you're the person who said something about a superior officer that wasn't quite right. That follows you. Longer than you'd think. Longer than it should, probably, but that's not really up to either of us. He said it all lightly, almost sympathetically, as if he were doing her a favor by warning her. There was no threat in his words if you wrote them down and read them back. Nothing Castillo could have flagged. Nothing that would sound like anything other than a senior officer offering guidance to a green private. But Olivia felt the weight of it settle into her chest exactly the way a threat would have. And she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that he had chosen every word on purpose. I appreciate that, sir, she said, because it was the only thing she could think to say. Good talk, Brooks. He gave her the same smile from the hallway, the one that had once made her feel welcomed, and peeled off toward the headquarters building, leaving her standing alone in the lot with her pulse loud in her ears. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in her bunk running his words over and over, trying to decide whether she'd imagined the warning underneath them, and finding, each time, that she hadn't. By the end of that week, Olivia had stopped sleeping through the night. She'd wake at odd hours turning Reyes's words over again, trying to find the version of them that wasn't a warning, and never quite managing it. During the day, she kept her routine exactly as it had been. Formation, duty, chow, the motor pool gap in the fence. But something in her had gone quiet in a way that wasn't like her usual quiet. Denise noticed first. They were folding laundry in the barracks common room, a task that usually came with easy conversation, and Olivia realized she'd gone 3 full minutes without saying anything at all. Okay, Denise said, setting down a stack of PT shirts. What's going on with you? Nothing, tired. You've been tired for a week. That's not tired, that's something else. Denise studied her for a moment, and Olivia braced for a joke, the kind Denise usually made to cut through tension. It didn't come. This is about the CID thing, isn't it? The Building 4 stuff. Olivia hadn't told her any of it. Not the meeting, not what she'd overheard, not Reyes in the parking lot. She'd been careful about that, the same way she'd been careful with Castillo. But apparently she hadn't been careful enough to hide what it was doing to her. I can't really talk about it, Olivia said, which was true in more ways than one. Denise didn't push, but she didn't let it go entirely either. Whatever it is, she said, folding the last shirt with more attention than the task required. You don't have to carry it by yourself just because you can't talk about the details. Those aren't the same thing. Olivia thought about that sentence for the rest of the night. 2 days later, Castillo called her back in, and this time the conversation was different from the start. He didn't ease into it. He laid a manila folder on the desk between them, unopened, and said, I want to be straight with you, Brooks, because I think it'll help you understand why this matters. The documents that went missing weren't just administrative paperwork. They involved a contract award, equipment procurement, a significant dollar amount. The timeline shows the file was accessed and altered the same week you were on duty in that building. We're not just looking at a paperwork error. We're looking at whether someone falsified records to steer that contract somewhere it shouldn't have gone." Olivia felt something cold settle in her stomach. "I don't know anything about a contract, sir." "I believe you. But you might know something about the timeline, and right now the timeline is the whole case. We have 3 officers who say they were never in that building together that night. We have a signed-in log with your handwriting in it. If your account of what you saw and heard matches what we already suspect, it closes a gap we can't close any other way. If it doesn't, that's useful too. Either way, Brooks, you're not a bystander in this anymore. You're the only witness we've got who was actually in that hallway." He didn't ask her anything else that day. He let her sit with it instead, and she left the office with the manila folder's weight following her, even though it had never left his desk. That night she found herself outside the NCO break room long after her own shift had ended. Not entirely sure why she'd walked there until Master Sergeant Dawes looked up from his coffee and asked if she was lost. Dawes was close to retirement, 22 years in, the kind of NCO who'd stopped needing to prove anything to anyone a long time ago. He wasn't in her chain of command, which was probably why she found it easier to sit down across from him than she would have with anyone who might report back to her platoon sergeant. "Can I ask you something, Sergeant? Hypothetically." "Hypothetically." He almost smiled. "Sure. If a private saw something that could get an officer in real trouble, serious trouble, and telling the truth about it might cost that private their career before it even really started, what would you tell them to do?" Dawes didn't answer right away. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, the way a man does when he's deciding how much of an answer someone actually wants. "I'd tell them," he said finally, "that I've seen soldiers protect the wrong people plenty of times, thinking it was loyalty. And I've seen soldiers stay quiet, thinking it was safety. Neither one of those ever actually turned out to be either one, in my experience. But I'd also tell them nobody else gets to make that call for them. Not me, not their sergeant, not the officer they're scared of. It's theirs to make. All I can tell you is which version a person can live with tends to be a lot easier to spot in hindsight than it is right now." "That's not really an answer, Sergeant." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But you didn't ask me a hypothetical question, Brooks, and we both know it. I think you already know what you're going to do. I think you're just looking for somebody to tell you it's going to be okay before you do it." Olivia didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have confirmed exactly what he'd just told her. She didn't sleep much that night either. But for the first time in a week, it wasn't because she was turning the question over without an answer. It was because she already had one, and morning felt like it was arriving too fast and not fast enough at the same time. At 0900 the next day, she walked into Building 2 for her final interview with Castillo. Her uniform pressed, her hands steady in a way they hadn't been in days. Whatever was about to happen, she wasn't walking in undecided anymore. Castillo had the recorder running before Olivia had fully settled into the chair, and this time she didn't wait for him to ask the first question. "I need to correct my earlier statement," she said. "I told you I couldn't make out what was said in that room. That wasn't true. I could hear parts of it. I didn't tell you because I was scared of what it would mean if I did." Castillo's expression didn't change, but he set down his pen and gave her his full attention in a way he hadn't before. "Go ahead, Brooks." She told him everything. The exact time she'd logged. The 3 officers by name, Whitfield, Reyes, and the major she hadn't recognized, whose name she'd since learned was Osei. She repeated the fragments she'd overheard as precisely as she could remember them, careful to say, "I believe he said," rather than pretending to a certainty she didn't have. And then she told him about the parking lot, about Reyes falling into step beside her, about the warm, easy tone that had carried a message underneath it that no transcript would ever fully capture but that she'd understood perfectly at the time. "He didn't threaten me directly," she said. "I want to be fair about that, but he made sure I understood what could happen to me if my account of that night caused problems for him. I think that's relevant to your investigation, too." Castillo asked careful, specific questions for another 20 minutes, and when he was finished, he closed the folder and looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile but was close to respect. "That took a lot more than most people are willing to give us, Brooks. I want you to know that. Will it be enough?" It's a piece. An important one. I can't tell you where the case lands from here. That's not my call to make alone. But you did your part. That's what I can tell you. The weeks that followed were not the clean, satisfying resolution Olivia might have imagined if she'd let herself imagine one. There was no dramatic announcement, no moment where the whole battalion learned what she'd done and treated her like she'd earned a medal. What happened instead was quieter and messier and more true to how these things actually worked. Major Osei was reassigned within the month, his transfer processed with unusual speed and very little explanation offered to anyone below a certain rank. Colonel Whitfield retired earlier than his timeline had suggested, a retirement that carried the particular flavor of an exit arranged rather than chosen. Reyes remained on base longer, his promotion board quietly postponed. An investigation into obstruction opened alongside the original case. Olivia's account of the parking lot conversation cited, she later learned, as a contributing factor. Some people in her unit treated her differently after word got around. In the vague, half-accurate way these things always traveled. A few looked at her like she'd done something disloyal, something a private shouldn't have had the nerve to do. More people, though, people she hadn't expected, senior NCOs and even a captain from another company, gave her small, private nods of acknowledgement that meant more to her than she would have predicted. Denise never asked for details, but she started saving Olivia a seat at chow without being asked, which was its own kind of statement. Master Sergeant Dawes found her outside the motor pool a few weeks later and didn't say much beyond, "Heard you figured out your own answer." She'd nodded, and he'd nodded back, and that had been the whole conversation. And it had been enough. Her father called 2 months after it was over, having heard some sanitized version of events from an old Army friend still connected to the base's grapevine. He didn't ask for the full story, and she didn't offer it. "Heard you did something difficult," he said instead, which was as close as he ever came to saying he was proud of her. And she understood it exactly that way. Olivia thought sometimes about the version of herself who had sat at that desk in Building 4 2 weeks into her first duty station, certain that the safest thing she could do was stay invisible and let the moment pass unremarked. She didn't judge that version of herself too harshly. She had been young and frightened, and had every reason to believe that silence was the safer road. It had taken her weeks of sleepless nights and one honest conversation with an NCO who refused to make the decision for her to understand that safety and rightness weren't always the same thing, and that sometimes the cost of telling the truth was smaller than the cost of the person she'd have had to become to keep living with the alternative. She still wasn't sure some nights that she'd made the easy choice, but she'd stopped needing it to be easy. She only needed it to be hers, and it was. That's the story of Private Olivia Brooks, the recruit who learned that courage doesn't always look like a battlefield. Sometimes it's just one person, telling the truth when it would have been easier not to.